Alrighty. Good luck, man.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone. This is Salsa, spicy CRM integration for Drupal-Powered nonprofits. My name is John Shortis. I am the Director of Technology at Foresight Interactive Studios. We are a small interactive agency up in Columbia Heights. We primarily work with DC-based nonprofits, and we try to drive user engagement and help our clients build communities with their users. And one of the big tools that we use to do that is Salsa. And just to grab some verbiage from Salsa's website, for those of you who might not be familiar with Salsa. Salsa helps nonprofits build, organize, and engage a base of support with tools to communicate, fundraise, advocate, and build community. So Salsa is a CRM as a service for nonprofits and political campaigns. It is probably the biggest nonprofit-focused CRM that hasn't been bought by Blackbaud. It started about 10 years ago as Democracy in Action, was later known as Wired for Change. Their primary focus is progressive advocacy organizations. They're based in DC, up in DuPont Circle, maybe a mile from our office. So we talk to them all the time. And a little more about Salsa. They've got over 2,000 clients and over 75 million supporters. Some of their, just a handful of their clients are Electronic Frontier Foundation, the DLCC, the League of Women Voters, and two that we work with, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the National Association of Court-Appointed Special Advocates, or CASA. And you're going to be seeing some slides from a site that we built for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called preventobesity.net. I'll tell you a little bit more about that a little bit later. So a little bit of very quick background on how Salsa works. Salsa is a modular system. There are more than 4 modules, but the modules are all based around 4 main types of activities. Organize your supporters, fundraise, so secure your supporters' financial support, communicate with your supporters, and organize, advocate, spur them to action. Internally, each module has a number of what Salsa calls objects, and I've got objects in quotes here because it's not objects in a programming sense. They're really database tables. And the main object that you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with it just within Salsa or integrating with it, is the supporter. So a supporter is someone that your organization has a relationship with. So someone who has signed up on a page, signed a petition, given your organization money. Salsa considers those supporters. Then you have lots of other objects. You have groups, you have donations, you have events, you have petitions, and each of those objects has its own unique key. So you have a supporter key, which is this really long number. You have a donation key for a donation, and then there's a link table that connects the two. So you know that supporter number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and donation number 5, 6, 7, 8 are linked together through another table. So I'm going to talk about 4 main types of Drupal Salsa integration. The first is you're just linking to a Salsa posted form, and that's not really mild Salsa. That's really more like ketchup. It's and you're familiar with this. You just link to an external site, and on that external site they've got a template. So you upload a template and you try and make it look like the rest of your site, and then you change a link on your main site and you forget to change it on the Salsa template, and links start breaking, and you change your look and feel, and it's never quite right. They make it as easy as they can, but it's not an ideal solution. So that's all I'm going to say about just linking to Salsa. Medium Salsa. It's really, it's not all that spicy yet, but it's what Salsa calls unauthenticated forms. And what that is, this is a totally unthemed example. And it's just a really simple HTML form that submits to Salsa. So there are two ways of creating this. You can go through Salsa's UI, you generate a form, and it can be a sign-up form like this, it can be a donation form. With donation forms, you run into problems with secure servers. It can be a petition, and you can generate that in the Salsa UI. And then you take the HTML, you change about 3 things in the HTML, and really what you're doing is you're changing relative links to absolute links. Or you can just, if you know HTML, you can build your form directly. You just need to know what the field names are, you need to know where it's submitted. Another thing to keep in mind, it's not authenticated. So you can save, but you can't read, you can't edit. So it's good for signups, it's good for petitions, it's not good for anything where you're pulling data or changing existing data. One thing that the unauthenticated form feature has is a flash message JavaScript widget. And it's just one line of JavaScript that lets Salsa talk back to your form. And what this is primarily used for, if the user does not fill in a required field, it can give back an error message. So this is how that's created. I'll walk you through this. The first line is just that one line of JavaScript that powers the flash message. Then we've got an HTML form that just points to your organization's Salsa node, and it's whatever your organization is assigned to, and it's just attaching to the save controller on that node. Then there is a hidden field that tells Salsa the data that I'm sending to you is on the supporter object. And then the next field, since we're not authenticated, we need to pass through the organization key. Otherwise, Salsa doesn't know who to save it for. And then we got just 2 text fields here, email and a zip code. And you just have to make sure that your field names are the same as what Salsa expects. And then the last thing I've got here is another hidden field called required. And that's just a comma-separated list of field names telling Salsa which fields you want to make required. You also have to put in, I don't have it here, but if you have the normal red asterisk that says it's required, you have to do that in the form yourself. But what this hidden field will do is it tells Salsa, if those fields aren't filled in, send back a message through that flash widget. And then just a submit button. So really, really easy, not particularly Drupal-y yet. So now we're starting to get a little spicier here. Using two modules called Salsa API and Salsa Entity. The Salsa API module, and let me go back and give you a little bit of history. There were a bunch of Salsa modules for Drupal 5 and Drupal 6, and they were mostly handling pretty specific use cases. So you had a module that would link to events, a module that would sync supporters with Drupal users. And they didn't work together terribly well, and it was someone created a module to support a specific use case for a specific project. They released it to the community. As the Drupal Salsa community has evolved, you started consolidating around 2 modules. So the first one is Salsa API. I'm the current maintainer of that module, and that is basically the conduit between Drupal and Salsa's external API. It's a RESTful API. You can read from or write to just about any Salsa object. The Salsa Entity module builds on the Salsa API module, and it exposes those Salsa objects as Drupal entities. And the maintainer of the Salsa Entity module is a Swiss developer named Sasha Grossenbecker. He goes by Beardeer on Drupal.org. So I work with him. We contribute code to each other's modules, and we try and keep in sync on does the API need to handle something new to support a new feature in Salsa Entity and vice versa. So far, these are most of the most common supported objects. supporters, groups, sign-up pages, donate pages, questionnaires, tell a friend pages, events, petitions, targeted actions, unsubscribe pages. So it's most of the user-facing Salsa objects are now supported in Entity. There are a couple that aren't supported yet. The most notable is company/organization. So if you have a supporter, they can be affiliated with an organization. A lot of organizations do this to create pseudo chapters because they don't want to buy the chapters module from Salsa. The next time we have a client comes through that needs that, I'm going to write a Salsa entity submodule to support that. If Beardeer doesn't beat me to it, or someone else in the community doesn't beat me to it. So what are the advantages of doing a Salsa integration in Drupal, particularly using the Salsa entity module? First of all, the forms and most of the user-facing Salsa objects are forms. They're rendered using Drupal's regular form API, which means they're themable and they're alterable just like any other Drupal form. So no more maintaining 2 sets of templates. You can also do form alters. So if you have a custom module that's doing very specialized things with your forms, you can customize your Salsa forms in the same way. There's entity reference integration that supports autocomplete. So when this company module gets written, someone will be able to go in and sign up and autocomplete to find their organization. There's rules integration. There is very basic views integration through the EFQ views module. It has some issues, but at a very basic level, it works. There is another submodule of Salsa entity called Salsa Profile. So this is a zoomed-in screenshot of a site that we just finished for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's called preventobesity.net. Prevent Obesity is designed to organize people around the country who are working to fight the childhood obesity epidemic. So it is PTA moms, it's pediatricians, it's soccer coaches, and they have over 300,000 supporters around the country and over 3,000 leaders. So supporter is basically just anyone who signs up on the site and is interested. Leaders are people who are actively working to organize others. And leaders have their own accounts on the site. The Salsa Profile module adds a new tab to the user page called Edit Profile. And you get a form, and you can, this is all of the standard supporter fields, which are your typical demographic fields, your address, your phone number, your email address, lots of other stuff too, and you don't want to expose all of that. So there are ways to prevent things being, so you don't necessarily want a user to be able to go in and edit how many email bounces they had, or what their source code is. So did they come in through a particular campaign? Where did you acquire that supporter? So through form alters, you can go in and say, I don't want to display these fields, or I want to display these fields in a particular way. So that's all, if you're a Drupal developer, that's very, very, very basic stuff, going in and manipulating how something is displayed on a form. The Salsa Profile module also has an optional block that you can put on the user sign-up page. So when a user is going in, we don't use it here because these are not, you can't just go and sign up for an account. You have to be given an account if you're working as a leader. But if you have a page, if you have a site where someone can sign up for an account, you can add this block to the regular Drupal sign-up form and collect demographic information directly from the sign-up page. And like I said, Salsa entity forms are themable and alterable, just like any Drupal form. So it makes for really nice looking forms if you do the work to theme them correctly, which makes it look nicer, but also increases conversions. So we redesigned this and increased conversions, I think, by like about 400%. But now we get into the really fun stuff, using the Salsa API as a framework for writing your own custom code. And from a development standpoint, Salsa API module creates a class with several methods. Those methods correspond very closely to the calls in Salsa's external API. And if you're developing custom code, there are 3 main methods that you're going to use. The first one is getObject, and this gets a single object of a specified type by its unique key. So there's 2 lines of code here. The first is just filling in a variable with a supporter key, and then just calling Salsa API getObject, telling it, I'm getting a supporter with this key. And what that comes back with is an array. That array is the complete supporter object. So it's all of the standard fields, also all of the custom fields. So you can create custom fields on your supporters. So if you want to collect their Twitter address, although I think that is standard now, but you can define your own fields and you can do whatever you want to with them. So I have a custom field that is their Drupal user ID. We have lots of other things that collect various bits of information. But you're just going in and you're dealing with this like any other array. Normally you don't know what your user, you're not just collecting one user, you're not just requesting one user by ID. So there's a much more useful method called getObjects, plural. And that lets you request multiple objects or one object based on a condition. So, and there's also a lot more flexibility here. So I'm doing a couple of things here. The first thing is I'm building an array telling which fields I want to include. So if I don't want to pull all 30, 40, 50 fields, I can't remember exactly how many there are, and it depends on how many custom fields you have created. So you just tell it which field names you want. Then you're looking for conditions. That is also an array. So what I'm looking for here, somewhere above this snippet of code, I would have a variable called last run. And I'm looking for supporters that have been modified since this bit of code ran the last time. And then I'm going to be ordering that by the last modified field in descending order. And then there's a limit. And limits and offsets work together, and they're actually the same property on the request. Salsa's external API has a limit. You can only request 500 objects in any API request. So if you have thousands or tens of thousands of supporters, you have to iterate through in batches of 500. So what I'm doing is I've got a variable here that is just defining whatever my current offset is. I'm pulling 500, and then I increment that offset by 500 the next time I run it. So then you pass all of those parameters to Salsa API and the getObjects method. And what that will return is an array of objects. So instead of just that single array that contains that one supporter, like we saw in the last method, this is an array of Salsa supporters, and that's indexed by the supporter key. So you can just iterate through that array and see all of your supporters if you're creating a list or doing something with them. So that's how you get data from. To send data to, there is a save method, and you first have a variable that's an array of keys and values. So first name is John, last name is Doe, email is john@zoom.com, and zip is 02134, for those of you who watch PBS as kids. There's another option here called links. And what links are, you don't need to use them, but if you need to save in multiple objects at the same time, you can do it this way. And this uses the link tables that I talked about earlier. So Salsa has supporters, Salsa also has groups. So if you need to group your supporters, based on interest or based on for Prevent Obesity, there were issue areas that we were grouping supporters by, or grouping leaders by, but also states that they were active in. So if there was someone in the District of Columbia that was also doing work in Virginia and Maryland, their address says they're in DC, but we want their state active to be DC, Virginia, and Maryland. So we do that as a group. And in your links variable, you're just passing an array saying, when you save this supporter, we're also going to add them to group 10,000 and group 10,001. And then you're just passing all of those parameters to your save method. This is the home page, and there are a couple things of note here that are coming from Salsa. The first is this big form at the top of the page, and that is a Salsa sign-up form, but it's very highly customized, and a lot of that is coming from a content type in Drupal. So this is what we call a featured campaign. So the call to action text in the blue box on the left, the background photo, the text in the button, and a couple of hidden fields that are like the source field, the source code, saying that they came from the preventobesity.net homepage. Those are all fields on a custom content type in Drupal. And then we pull the form from Salsa and we marry the two together in the theme layer. Then the leaderboard below that is pulling live supporter and leader counts from Salsa. And here's a little snippet of that code. And supporters and leaders on this site are a little bit complicated because it's not just all supporters. It's all supporters who have opted into certain things and are members of certain groups, and there's a lot of business rules that we had to take into account when we were generating those totals. Rather than sending a really complex query that joins across half a dozen tables to Salsa, and joins do have issues across the Salsa API, we canned those queries. So we built a pre-saved query, which Salsa calls a report. And rather than saying, give me all supporters who are members of this group who filled in this opt-in field, I can just say, Salsa, give me report 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it throws back an array, and I can just iterate through that array to get the data that I need. So I'm pulling total leaders out of that in the second line here. That would work, but what if Salsa is being slow or Salsa goes down? You don't want that to break your home page. So I just have a couple of extra lines of code here that if Salsa API returns an error, I catch the exception, and then I pull that data from a Drupal variable. And then if I successfully retrieve the total number of supporters, I save it to that variable. So it acts as just a very simple cache, so that I've always got some place to pull that data from, even if I can't talk to Salsa for whatever reason. So that's a fourth method. Those are the only ones I'm going to go into. I see a question in the back.
Do you pull that every time you load the page, or does it get cached?
It gets cached just as a Drupal variable, but the block is also being cached. So whenever the cache for that block expires, it pulls a new one. So I'm not doing it every time. There's lots of other things you can do with Salsa data. So the primary thing that preventobesity.net does is it's a network of leaders and supporters. So you want to be able to search for leaders and browse through leaders. So we have a Find Leaders page. And you see we got a name, the occupation, the organization, and the location. That's all coming from Salsa. The name is linked to that leader's Drupal user page. There's also a secure contact form where you can contact that leader. We don't want to expose the email address, so we don't want to list that so that spam bots can harvest it. And so we just want to be able to call up a form and let someone be able to send a message to that leader without exposing the email address. So those two things are coming from Drupal. So what we've done Salsa entity will expose the supporter as a pseudo entity. So it's a remotely stored entity. So you're not filling your Drupal database with all of this data. It's pulling it from Salsa, but then once it's pulled from Salsa, you can work with it like an entity. But what we've done here is we've created a local cache. So the proof of concept for this was just pulling across using a view using EFQ views, entity field query views. It worked. It was very, very, very slow. So what we did, we created a cache that is another custom entity that pulls the data from that Salsa entity, just the fields we need, pulls some fields from the Drupal user, just the fields we need, and is a custom entity. Rather than using EFQ views, I just built a custom module that pages through the entity field query directly. So this is not a view, even though it looks like one. You also see the drop-downs at the top, active in state and interested in issue. And those are Salsa groups, which there would have to be a join if we were doing that directly in Salsa. But I'm pulling that in as another table, or as another custom entity, and joining locally in Drupal, which is much faster. That same data we're using to power a map. And this may have gone live today, or it may go live on Monday. I'm not sure exactly when, but this is a mapbox.js map. Again, working with the locally cached copy of the data from Salsa. Salsa automatically geocodes your supporters based on the address. We don't really want to give street-level geodata, street-level mapping for all of these supporters and leaders for privacy reasons. So what we do is we just geocode on the zip code. And since it's just the zip code, we're doing that in a local table. So we have a local table that is all of the zip codes in the US and the latitude and longitude of the geographic center of that zip code. So I can just do that as a lookup locally, very fast, and I don't have to worry about using a Google Maps API query limit or something. That table also has some other data that lets us do aggregation by county, by metropolitan area. So as you zoom in on the map, you're seeing the orange circles, which are groups of supporters. But as you zoom in, that would break down to metropolitan area, to county, and then to zip code. And would always be aggregated. The green clusters are leaders. And then as you zoom in, you're going to get the little happy guy is an individual leader. So those clusters get smaller and smaller, and then they will spider out. And you can hover over them and get the same information that you saw in the table view. And you can click through and see their contact information or contact them directly. So all of that is indirectly coming from Salsa. We use Salsa as the system of record, but there's a local cache of it. And that's kind of where things are now. You can do a lot working with the API module directly. If your needs aren't quite as specialized, you can use the Salsa entity module and pull in just about every Salsa form. You can customize that form. You can load in user data. You can have those users save their data to Salsa. Or you can do the easy route and do your forms directly with Salsa. So there are a couple new API methods that I'll be working on as I have time that make it easier to tag. So I can just say, add this tag to this supporter rather than joining across another table. There are a few objects that are not yet supported in Salsa entity, like company. We're starting to think about Drupal 8 versions. I think we're going to wait for another month or 2 or 3 for things to settle down a little more. But that's kind of where things are. There's still a lot of time for questions.
Only Drupal 7 or Drupal 6 as well?
Salsa Entity is Drupal 6 only, or sorry, Drupal 7 only. Salsa API does have a Drupal 6 version. It is a different architecture. It is not a class with methods. It is function-based. But it's the same basic functionality. It's slower. It does not have the the exception handling that the Drupal 7 version has, but you can do the same basic stuff with it. Yes.
I work for a museum, so I want to know two questions. Do you ever work doing memberships? And also, have you gotten this to hook into Razor's Edge at all?
I mean, Razor's Edge is a different CRM system. You could
Use it
do.
on like the back end part, but never for like users. So like it's we use it internally,
Right.
but then hook into the CRM.
You could do that. I mean, it would take a fair amount of custom work. So you would use Salsa on the external side and Razor's Edge on the internal side. I have not looked at Razor's Edge API in a while, but from memory, that should be pretty straightforward. It would not be trivial though. But yeah, should be easy. Yeah, should be not easy, but should be not a huge, heavy lift to do. Yes.
Having worked with other management packages, this is an important question to ask, I think. How well do you think the API is documented, and what was your experience like working with Salsa?
I like the guys at Salsa a lot, and gals at Salsa. Very helpful. The documentation has improved tremendously in the past year and a half or so. And they are working on a new version of the API. And it sounds like they are making documentation a bigger priority in the new version of the API. So they are documenting it as they go along rather than trying to document things after the fact. And it seems like it's going to be better structured and nicer to work with. But the documentation has improved tremendously since I started working with Salsa not quite 2 years ago. Yes.
Maybe another way to ask that question is, how do you compare their documentation to other CRM documentation?
It's Salesforce has better documentation, but I hate working with Salesforce. I mean, I will work with Salesforce, but I enjoy Salsa more. Part of that's because I maintain the modules, so I know the guts of the API much more than I do, say, Salesforce. But I think all of the major CRM manufacturers know we can't have a completely closed system. We have to be interacting with systems like Drupal and WordPress, and so they have to have some sort of open API. How open it is varies. Salsa's API is pretty open. There are some undocumented methods in their API that I'm aware of just because the developers at Salsa Labs have told me about them. There aren't that many of them. I think it's pretty open as far as the API goes, but I have been known to cheat a couple of times here and there on projects because I know about things that are not documented. Did I see another
You end up buying
hand?
a lot of beers on these projects.
What's that?
You end up buying a lot of beers.
I have bought my share of beers, yes, for the developers at Salsa Labs. And like I said, they are based in DC, and they do have a community conference. I think it's in October this year. So there, I'm sure will be plenty of mentions of that on salsalabs.com. Yeah, back there in the
What's your
market.
experience with the donation piece? Because they've always steered us to just host all of the secure forms on their server.
As long as you can deal with SSL and deal with, I think what they are concerned about is having the mix of secure and non-secure content on a form, which is what you're dealing with anytime you have a secure form. As long as you know how to deal with that, in my experience, it's fine. I think that's more a CYA on their end. I have done external donation forms, had never run into any problems. But they say, okay, we can't be responsible. Yeah, we're responsible for what comes across the API, but if there is an insecurity on the form itself before it gets to us meaning them, then they're not responsible for it. So it's a CYA on their part, but I have not run into any issues.
You guys ever done anything with membership programs instead of just
Oh,
donations?
that's right, you asked about that. You can do that pretty easily in Salsa. I'm trying to remember, you would do a donation and then you can tie that to, I'm trying to remember what the best practice for doing that is, but yes, it is supported in Salsa, and the Salsa Drupal integration would support that as well.
Okay.
I would have to go back and look at the API documentation and see exactly what the way of doing that in the donation module is.
Feature set for Salsa versus Convio. I know you're not a Salsa or Convio salesman.
Right.
Have you? How would you compare them?
I haven't worked with Convio myself in a while, and when I work with it, I'm generally doing fairly focused things with it, so I'm not as familiar with the full feature set as I was a couple of years ago, which was back when it was Get Active, before Convio bought them and before Convio got bought by Blackbaud. There are other people that I work with who are much more up to date on it. You had another question?
So, I was interested that the local entity that you cache
Uh-huh.
of all these results, how, if the call is limited to 500, do you just have to keep calling until you get all of the...
Yeah, so we're doing that in a cron job in the background, and it's able to do it based on the last modified date. So we're only pulling them in as they get modified in Salsa. So it's not like we're pulling in the entire batch of 300,000 every night. We're only pulling in the ones that change that day. And for this use case, we don't really have to do it every day. So I think we're doing it two times a week, 3 times a week. But it works pretty well. The only problem with that is if a member leaves a group, because the way you know someone is a member of a group is there's the entry in the supporter groups link table. If someone leaves a group, that entry disappears, so you have to sync your groups tables more frequently to find supporters who have left. But that's much less data than pulling in all of your supporters. So that's the main limitation to that. And they're aware of that. They say, yeah, there's not really an easy way around that. So I work around it on the Drupal side.
Or they just have a delete flag in the record.
They could do that.
So a lot of databases do that.
Yeah, so maybe in the next version of the API, we can help. Anybody else? Yes.
I'm interested in how you're doing the autocomplete on entities. Is that cached locally, or are you doing some kind of AJAX back and forth?
I have not worked with that part of the Salsa entity module, so I couldn't tell you. I could look into it, but Birdier would be the person to ask for that, and he's in Switzerland, so I could look into it. I just have not dealt with that part of that module. Do I see a hand in the back? Are you stretching? Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much. And if you have any questions that arise later, here's my contact information. I will be posting slides and probably a blog post in the next couple of days at foresightstudios.com. So probably go into a little more depth on a couple of things. And that's also that, and my Twitter account and the Foresight Twitter account would be also good ways to keep up with developments. So Drupal 8 versions, newly supported methods, new versions of the module. So thank you very much.
Nice job, man.